On the 16th of August 2012, 34 South African mine workers were gunned down by police at Marikana, just northwest of Johannesburg. There are lots of questions that this massacre has thrown up. Why were largely unarmed striking workers deemed such a threat to the South African state that their lives had to be ended by force? Why were mortuary vans and thousands of rounds of live ammunition delivered to the protest site on the morning of the massacre? Why have transcripts of telephone conversations and emails and video footage emerged which shows that the police action that day was actually planned several days in advance? Why did the narrative of violent miners attacking police and the security forces having to open fire in self-defence, why did that entirely false narrative get propagated by government ministers, by a supportive media establishment, by the companies themselves? Now, those are all questions which deserve an answer, but there's also a wider set of questions that I'm trying to explore in my book, which is, what does this massacre tell us about contemporary South Africa? What does it tell us about the Rainbow Nation that successfully threw off the shackles of apartheid and achieved liberation, only to find that in 2012 they were living in a state where the police were still able to collude with a British mining company based in Belgravia, and at the end of the day 34 innocent workers would lose their lives. People have said that the Marikana massacre has destroyed establishment lies and illusions. The questions that the massacre has raised have to be asked and answered, not just by people within South Africa, but beyond its borders as well. If you think about the massacres which made so many headlines during the era of racial segregation, such as the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, the violence used against the Soweto uprising in 1976, they had certain things in common which I think you can also identify, despite the different circumstances and the different context, with Marikana. For one thing, the specific demands that protesters were using in all of these occasions may have appeared at first glance to be relatively isolated. At Sharpeville, protesters were resisting the pass laws, the hated pass laws. In 1976 in Soweto, students were protesting the use of Afrikaans as a language of teaching in schools. And at Marikana, people were asking for a living wage. But actually, when you unpick what those demands meant for the broader political and economic system in South Africa at the time, they were actually far more significant because they struck at the heart of the inconsistencies and the inequities of the status quo. In previous incidents of apartheid-era state violence, there was almost always an establishment cover-up. And again, that took place at Marikana. We now know, and we have video footage of officers trying to plant weapons on the corpses of miners that had died. So there are threads of continuity throughout, but I think the biggest thread of continuity is that these apartheid-era massacres came to define the particular epoch of South African history that they took place in. They, as I say, they were a window onto the broader social dynamics at that time, and I think Marikana very, very much fits into that category. People have talked about Marikana essentially exposing and destroying the illusions of post-apartheid democratic South Africa, and in the same way that Soweto and Sharpeville caused people not just within South Africa's borders but beyond to question some of the fundamentals about the stories that they were being told about this nation. I think Marikana has done the same. The transition to a democratic South Africa happened at a time when neoliberalism and Chicago School economics was rampant. It was towards the end of the Cold War. China was liberalising its economy. Francis Fukuyama had brought out his famous treatise on the end of history. The problem is, at that time, South Africa was making history, not ending history. And I think there was a real fear among international financial institutions and the representatives of global capital that this incredibly powerful and inspiring liberation movement that contained within it genuinely transformative hopes for a different type of politics, a different type of economics and a different type of future might challenge that consensus. So firstly, there was a huge amount of pressure on the incoming ANC government from external forces to accept neoliberal orthodoxy. But I think it's also important to point out that the ANC was not a passive player in this shift. There have always been different factions within the movement, some more to the left, some more to the right. And those right-wing factions, including the ones led by Thabo Mbeki, the Nelson Mandela's successor as president, won out against the leftists. And there was a real struggle within the movement and within the party to essentially narrow the dreams of its supporters base and to accept the existing economic structure, the only tinkering being the elevation of a few well-connected, politically powerful black faces into the boardrooms of the mining industry and the other monopoly industries, which generated so much lucrative wealth for the few and so much poverty and exclusion for the many. The one thing that you can say about South Africa in 2015 is that the status quo is not sustainable. The brother of Mbeki, the former South African president, made a speech fairly recently in which he predicted that South Africa would one day face a Tunisia Day, i.e. a reference to the uprisings in the Arab world, suggesting that South African citizens would rise up against the current system of political rule. Well, in many ways, that is already happening. He predicted it could occur in 2020. I think we're beginning to see the stirrings of it right now. What the Marikana strike and massacre have done is forced many South Africans to question the basic tenets of procedural democracy. In many ways, South Africans, like many of us around the world, are trapped in a choiceless democracy. Not only is the ANC the largest party by a huge magnitude, but its main political rival is also signed up to the neoliberal consensus, something that people in Britain and elsewhere in the world living under liberal democracies will be very familiar with. So Marikana, in an immediate sense, has forced various kind of institutional political forces, certain trade unions, certain political parties, to reassess their ideological direction and what kinds of formations and alliances might challenge that sort of economic orthodoxy. But also I think it's inspired communities, grassroots settlements and towns and villages and informal neighbourhoods on the ground to think about how they can act outside of formal political channels to achieve change. One of the most inspiring things I found in Marikana, and that I talk about in the book, is that communities that are scattered right across South Africa, far, far from Johannesburg and far, far from the Marikana where the massacre occurred, communities who are engaged in struggles over eviction, over the delivery of local municipal services, over corruption in the local political parties. They have renamed themselves Marikana because it has become a byword for resistance. The last section of the book is entitled The Rise of the Marikanas, and the plural is very much deliberate. I think the fact that ordinary South Africans with the full weight of global capital and kind of the ANC political machine against them have achieved so many successes in terms of, despite the massacre, despite everything that's been thrown at them, they have achieved pay rises, they have stood firm, they have put themselves onto the political map. That's an inspiration for ordinary South Africans.